Hello, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. Just a quick introduction myself. As you can see on the slides, my name is Francis Pfluger. I'm a senior learning manager and executive coach here at IMD. I am joined by my colleague, my friend, and longtime leadership professor here at IMD, Professor Ginka Toegel. Hi, Ginka. Can you say hello?
Hi there. Thanks for joining.
Excellent. Thanks, Ginka. Thanks for joining as well. I'll be facilitating the discussion, and I'll be asking Ginka a bunch of questions and asking her to jump in. I think probably one thing that we should get out of the way here is that the future of leadership is an extremely broad topic, and we have 45 minutes for this webinar. So from an expectations, Ginka and I will be having a discussion at a very high level, and it's really just designed for you to get the thinking process going about the future of either your leadership or the people that you're leading. Since we're in an academic setting, Ginka, maybe one thing that would be really good is leadership as a term is also a very broad topic. Would you mind defining it for us or telling us what leadership is all about?
Right. I have been teaching this topic for more than 30 years. And as you can imagine, over those years, I have seen different fads and fashions. If I had to summarize what I have learned about leadership, I would say leadership is about two things. One is providing people with direction. Where are we heading? But actually, that's not enough. It has to be coupled with a second element of leadership, which is energy. So what does energy mean? It means motivating, inspiring, making people enthusiastic to achieve the goal.
Thanks. Well, one thing, as I said, I'm an executive coach here, and one question that I get asked quite a bit in the coaching room is, how does it differ from management? So leadership versus management.
There is a difference. Normally we cannot choose who our manager is going to be, purely because the manager is kind of prescribed in the organizational chart. However, as followers, we have the discretion to decide by whom we feel led, whom we're going to follow. And surprise, surprise, we follow people whom we trust. Why do we trust them? Because they come across as authentic.
Thanks. Yeah, that resonates very well. One thing I didn't hear in what you were describing was anything around charisma. How does charisma play into it?
Interesting that you are mentioning charisma, because there's a kind of a myth which seems to be quite persistent, about the importance of charisma. Actually, recent research suggests that charisma is neither a sufficient nor a necessary condition for effective leadership. But being an authentic person definitely is.
Well, that's good news for me. Thanks. Appreciate it. I think, we're going to talk about the future of leadership, but we're in an interesting time right now. So let's talk about, does leadership or your definition of leadership change at all in times of, say, crisis or heightened uncertainty as we are in right now?
Yeah. We human beings profoundly dislike the status of uncertainty. Why? Because uncertainty increases our level of anxiety and stress. So anything that helps us to kind of reduce the level of uncertainty and therefore the level of anxiety and stress is perceived as very beneficial for human beings.
Yeah.
So, as I already mentioned, one of the goals of leadership is to provide direction. So whenever we have a leader who provides a direction, our uncertainty gets decreased, and also our level of anxiety and stress also goes down. So, of course, in times of crisis, uncertainty goes up, therefore anxiety and stress go up, and our need of leadership, our need to see the direction, of course, gets increased. So think about the demands we had towards politicians over the last couple of months during the crisis.
Yeah.
So yes, in a sense, particularly in times of crisis, we need more leadership, we need more direction, but also more energy so that we can cope with the difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I feel that when my anxiety is reduced, it allows me more of that energy. So I see your energy bar going up there. It allows the energy for me to come out, right? But I have to reduce that anxiety before, and that leadership would help in the direction.
Right.
Wonderful. Okay, so how does all this start to play into the future of leadership? We got leading in a digital age. We're talking about the speed of change, most likely heightened uncertainty as we continue to go through. Is there anything that you see towards the future of leadership that could help the everyone that's on the webinar today, as well as myself?
Right. I don't think that we are going to rewrite the textbooks in leadership. It's going to be more a kind of an evolution, right, rather than a revolution. But for sure, certain leadership behaviors, and I would say some mindsets, will become much more prominent, much more important. So I would like us to discuss today 3 kinds of shifts that I have observed recently. Are these the only shifts which matter in the current stage? I'm sure not. We can add many more to those, but from where I sit and based on the experience that I have, I would say these 3 shifts have the potential to influence the effectiveness of leadership to a great deal in the current environment and also in the near future. So what are those shifts? I have labeled them as the identity shift, the mindset shift, and the paradigm shift. So as we talk about them, I'm going to encourage you just to think, how do those shifts translate in terms of capabilities? In other words, what would be the future-proof capabilities that we can extract from this discussion? And of course, they're hypothetical. But also those of you who work in the field of leadership development, would those shifts kind of inform your approach to designing leadership programs? So let's start with the first one. The first one is what I call an identity shift. So let's think about managers in organizations. So in the past, they kind of got promoted to their positions because they were considered the smartest people in the organization who could always provide the right answers. In other words, they perfected their capability of providing answers. Here's a problem, here's the answer. Actually, some bad news on the horizon because we have a competition. And the competition is artificial intelligence. Very soon, artificial intelligence is going to outsmart each and every one of us. And providing answers will no longer be a kind of a distinctive capability of leaders. Because artificial intelligence is going to process much better information and probably is going to come up with much more precise and better answers. So in the era of artificial intelligence, we can expect a kind of a profound shift to take place in terms of leaders' identity, because leaders won't be any longer perceived as the gurus who provide us with the answer. They're going to lose this status. But there is something else that leaders can do much better than smart machines, and it is asking good questions, thought-provoking questions so that then the machines can process and can come up with some answers. So it may be very seductive to be in the role of an individual who is always capable of providing answers. In that sense, this shift could be quite challenging for leaders. Think about our socialization. While we were at school, what were we rewarded for? Having the right answers. So we have been indoctrinated. It has been instilled in us this view that knowledge matters a lot because we can come up with good answers. But as I said, we will probably see the end of it, and I'm going to encourage you to think about a capability to ask questions. How developed is this capability in your organization?
Thanks, Ginka. And one thing that's coming to my mind, I fully agree and understand the shift from giving answers to asking questions. Why do you call it an identity shift?
Oh, yes. Why do we call it I would call it an identity shift. Our identity is influenced to a large extent by the so-called meta-perceptions. These are the perceptions that people around us have about us. So, and when we look at those meta-perceptions, there are three that matter to a great deal. One of them is the question, to what extent people around me perceive me as a competent individual? The second one is, do people around me perceive me as a good person? And the third one is, am I likable? Do people love me? So, and you can imagine when we shift from providing answers to asking questions, the first matter perception, am I going to be perceived as a competent individual, might be questioned. And in that sense, I think that in this case, we can talk about an identity shift. So, Francis, I would suggest that we kind of pause now. What is the conversation in the chat? Any kind of comment?
We have some questions already in the question and answer button, so I'm just going to throw out a few of them. We won't get to all of them, but I will throw out a few. One person is asking, how do leaders increase their authenticity, seeing it's critical in leadership?
Right. You know, I'm not a proponent of this thesis, fake it until you make it. Because actually we don't need to fake it. There's the cognitive route that we can use. So let's assume, for example, that I'm perceived as a bully. Okay, you might argue, you know what, this is my authentic self. But we can use the cognitive route to kind of argue, yes, I have this preference to kind of bulldoze other people, but you know, this is leading to nothing. I mean, I'm perceived as ineffective leader. I get much more from people when I'm not perceived as a bully. And here's the choice that we then have. I can either tone down my voice, and instead of telling people what to do, I can just tone down my voice, or I can shift to, let's say, asking questions. I can change my leadership style to asking questions, and by asking questions, I'm going to lead people in the direction in which I want. So not everything that we're used to has to be authentic. By engaging ourselves in conversations, reflections, insights about our behavior and the impact it has on others, we convince ourselves that this particular habit is not useful. And by doing so, we then move to behaviors which we believe are good for us. And when we believe in it, we also come across as authentic.
Wonderful, thank you. One other question, and I'm linking, it's nice that people are starting to move over to the chat with the questions. I'm working both, but one was the importance of self-awareness in leadership. And then I have Ahmad asking, how does a leader know how people around them perceive them? So the role of self-awareness and the ability to get that perception of it.
Yeah. Of course, if you ask people around, so tell me what are my strengths and weaknesses, in many cases they may be reluctant to talk about your weakness. They might say, here are your strengths, a laundry list, your weaknesses. I have difficult time to come up with some weaknesses. But there are indirect ways in which we can ask people around what they think about us. Tell me, what should I start doing, stop doing, continue doing? What should I do more of or less of? Which makes it a little bit easier for people to provide us with feedback. And of course, there are certain instruments. And the 360-degree feedback, for example. And if you have the feeling that people are not providing you with honest feedback, you can initiate a 360-degree, just talk to your HR department and initiate a 360-degree process. But I couldn't emphasize how important self-awareness is, purely because self-awareness gives us the opportunity to make choices about our behaviors, which behaviors are adequate in every single situation. I'm afraid we have to move now to the second shift.
We could probably spend 45 minutes on this one, but let's move on to the second shift just so we see everybody.
Precisely. So the second shift is what I would call a mindset shift. And the essence of the mindset shift is captured by the transformation of the word power that we have witnessed over, I would say, over the last couple of years. While in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we were talking a lot about power, the directionality of the word has changed, because nowadays it has become empower, how to empower other people. Let's remind ourselves. So at the end of the 90s, French and Raven came up with this framework of the 5 sources of power. Coercive power, the power to penalize people around us, reward power, legitimate power. This is the authority that flows down the hierarchy in the organization. Referent power, people whom we admire, we look up to them. And expert power based on knowledge and expertise that we have. At a later stage, information power was added to this list. But you know, it focuses on my sources of power, kind of ignoring more or less the rest of the world. And in the 21st century, it's almost kind of old-fashioned, because leadership is about interacting with other people. And in that sense, the directionality of the word is probably the wrong one, because we are much more interested in the interaction that we have with people around. So this kind of shift is accompanied also by a significant change of the centrality of leaders within their teams and within their organization. A kind of a phenomenon which we can call unbossing organizations. In a sense, the role of leader is currently changing. And it's shifting from leaders having been the major actors to leaders being much more the people who set the stage, who kind of orchestrate the performance of others, but at the same time, they give them the visibility so that they shine. They're there just to orchestrate their performance.
I'm going to ask you to give an example in just a second, but before I do, I have a question. I know that you direct 2 leadership programs at IMD, Mobilizing People and Strategies for Leadership.
Right.
How many of the executives that you see coming into the program have this mindset or need to do that mindset shift through the 9-day Mobilizing People program or the 4-day Strategies for Leadership program?
Unfortunately, I see a great deal of participants who struggle a lot with micromanagement. Even recently, I was facilitating a discussion on leadership challenge cases, and a few of those cases were around micromanagement and controlling people around. Yeah, quite a few.
Yeah, it's interesting because I always say to the executives, I coach quite a few of them here, that's one of the hardest shifts that they have is the ability to go from their own power to orchestrating across. Could you give us an example so we could maybe help us frame it?
Right. Let's think about a piece of music which we're listening to. So we hear the violin, we hear the piano. Do we hear the conductor? We don't. We know there is a conductor who makes it happen, who kind of orchestrates the whole performance, but we don't hear the conductor. And talking about conductors, let me give you also an example with Karajan. Initially, Karajan was a very directive conductor, and he was a perfectionist. Actually, he stayed a perfectionist till the end of his life, but he would be very precise, giving instructions to musicians how they have to perform. But then he started doing horse riding, and it helped him to make a major shift. And particularly towards the end of his life, he was very restrained in his gestures when he was conducting. So during one of the rehearsals, one of the musicians felt obviously a bit frustrated and asked a maestro, with all due respect, when should I start playing my tune? And Karajan responded, when you feel it's the time. And during a press conference, a journalist asked, Maestro, why don't you give precise indications to the orchestra? And Karajan responded, because that's the worst damage I could do to them. If I give precise instructions, then musicians would not listen to each other. So we can think of him in a sense, he's letting go some of his need to be in power. But by doing so, he's encouraging people, giving them the authority, the autonomy also to listen to people around and make decisions. And he also sends a message, I trust you, that you are going to make the right decision when you're going to join. The discussion that we're having right now is linked to an interesting paper which was published in 1985. And at that point, the title of this paper is The Romance of Leadership, and the authors are Mendel and two of his colleagues. And I have the feeling that Mendel was ahead of his time, because I remember vividly reading this paper in the 80s, and I personally found it fascinating, absolutely great. But then we forgot about it. So what was Mindful talking about? In this paper, the authors put forward some kind of rhetorical questions. For example, do we have a collective fascination with leadership? Do we have a kind of a tendency to glorify leadership? Do we have a romanticized view of the sole leader? And as followers, do we succumb to the charisma virus? Also, is solo leadership actually less important than we normally think? So this paper puts forward a kind of an idea which is very relevant for the 21st century. Should we replace this very romanticized view of unitary solo leadership and examine leadership not as a property of one single individual, but as a collective phenomenon that is shared among team members?
Ginka, I must say that the chat and the questions are going crazy. There's a lot around empowering versus micromanaging. Is there any competencies or anything that somebody could concentrate on that would help them either make this more difficult or easier to do? One, for themselves individually, and two, there's a bunch of questions around, what about my boss? Is there anything I can do for to change that micromanagement from my boss?
Yeah. So whenever you find yourself in a position of micromanagement, or you get this feedback that you are micromanaging, the first question that you need to ask yourself is, why am I doing it? And the answers could be so different. You might be doing it because you might have the feeling that for your boss, you're never good enough. And if you look a little bit closer, you might discover that you actually replicate the relationship that you had with your father or your mother. And your experience as a young child was that you were never good enough. So now you want to make sure that everything is controlled, so that whatever is sent upwards is perfect, so that you kind of are confident that the things that you will be evaluated on are absolutely glorious. You may be doing it for some other reasons. I'm speculating now, but you might say, if I do not control, if I do not add to whatever my direct reports have worked on, maybe I'm going to be perceived as superfluous, useless, because they're going to do their job so well. So I'm going to encourage you to think about the why. Quite often, and that's something I struggle with, we kind of work on certain skills, but there's something beneath those skills. It's the awareness why we're failing. Why are we doing or not doing certain things, which is probably much more important. Who can do it? In order for this shift to be successful, we need managers who embrace intellectual humility. The mindset needs to be, I have a certain expertise, but we are not going to be able to solve the problems based only on my expertise. We need the collective wisdom. I admire Edgar Schein. Edgar Schein was one of the most prominent consultants we have had. And in one of his papers, Edgar Schein describes how he would enter organizations when he consults. He would enter, and his first sentence would be, I'm the consultant, and I don't have the answers. So paraphrasing it, I'm the leader and I don't have the answers, but collectively we're going to come up with some. So Francis, shall we move to the next shift?
Yeah, just a reflection that what you just said is really important for the mindset shift of one, being able to ask questions. So they kind of tie into the two. But you're right, we're looking at, well, a good 13 more minutes left in this webinar, so maybe we should move on to shift number 3.
Right. So I have labeled the third shift the paradigm shift. What kind of paradigm am I talking about? In a sense, it is related to what we discussed around the identity shift. Leaders being able to always come up with answers. For a very long time, we have focused a lot on the cognitive intelligence of individuals, of leaders. But you know what? In the current environment, we see a shift taking place from focus on cognitive intelligence to focus on emotional intelligence. And it's kind of rebalancing the relationship between the two. Are we going to talk about emotional intelligence as the new oil in future? Is emotional intelligence going to replace cognitive intelligence? Yeah, just questions to ask. Historically, for a very long time, the emotion side of the leadership role has been consistently undervalued. But in the era of artificial intelligence, we can expect a kind of a premium on the emotion capabilities of leaders. In a sense, anything which makes us human is becoming very, very precious. Just to give you a quote here, nobody's really interested in your IQ. It's your ability to develop and maintain relationships. And there's a reason also why in the current environment, we are becoming more and more interested in emotional intelligence. And it has something to do with the so-called VUCA world in which we live: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The problems are so complex that no single individual, no matter how universal his or her capabilities are, will be able to come up with solutions. So we definitely need the wisdom of the collective. So we started talking about diversity a lot. But here's the caveat. If we compare the performance of homogeneous teams with the performance of diverse teams, it turns out that it's not always that diverse teams perform much better compared to homogeneous teams. In a sense, we have a kind of a bimodal distribution. If you see, if this yellow curve represents the distribution of homogeneous teams when they perform complex tasks, this is the distribution of diverse teams when they are poorly managed. In other words, when we have tensions, conflicts in the teams. Only diverse teams, which are well managed, have the potential to outperform homogeneous teams. Yes, we do need diversity in order to be able to solve the complex problems that we encounter in the current world. But we need an inclusive culture. And for this inclusive culture to take place, we definitely need emotional intelligence. So what I'm trying to say is things happen for a reason. In the first shift, we're talking about artificial intelligence kind of pushing for this shift to take place. Now we're talking about the complexity of the problems, the need to move to diverse teams. But again, for diverse teams to perform, we need an inclusive culture. For inclusive culture to take place, we do need more emotional intelligence. So now that we have discussed...
Hold on one second, Ginka. I do need to ask something, because I know from a competency, it's very easy. If I want to build my business acumen, I can come to IMD and do an executive MBA. Is there a few things that you could mention to the leaders on the webinar that would be helpful for them to build their emotional intelligence?
Yeah. Emotional intelligence is one of the skills that requires actually more work. And I don't want to discourage you at all, but it might take longer. Sometimes it might take even a couple of years to improve your emotional intelligence. But it is like all other intelligences. We can improve up to 30% of it. Emotional intelligence has 4 elements. The first one is identifying my own emotions and the emotions of other people. The second element is understanding where those emotions come from, what triggers those. The third one is using emotions. To give you an example, if we have to prove our budget, should my team be in a positive mood or in a negative mood? That's using emotions, putting the task and the emotions at hand and seeing to what extent those emotions are conducive for the task that needs to be performed. And the fourth element of emotional intelligence is regulating, managing my own emotions and, of course, the emotions of others. So each one of those elements of emotional intelligence needs, of course, work. And I have to tell you, I assumed that I'm kind of good at identifying emotions, looking at the facial expressions of people around me. And I remember when I did the test, it was long time ago, I was kind of negatively surprised to see that I need to do more work, that my kind of competency here was average. So we make a lot of assumptions about our emotional intelligence. So if I work on emotional intelligence in terms of understanding, more attention to the facial expressions of people around me. There's a nice book called The Emotionally Intelligent Manager by Caruso and colleague. So that could be a good start working on emotional intelligence.
Thank you. And I just want to answer one question, because a few people are asking, how do you actually measure emotional intelligence?
Yes.
And I know that we have the Mesquite at IMD, and there's probably also some tests online that'll help you with that. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
You would point them to?
Yeah, absolutely. Mesquite measures intelligence as intelligence. It's not my self-perception, how good am I? It's a test which gives you some situations which you need to evaluate, also facial expressions, and it's called Mesquite, Myers-Salloway Caruso Emotional Intelligence Test, abbreviated Mesquite.
Thank you.
Right. So
we go to the poll. We need to get some research data. Should we go to the poll?
Absolutely, because yes, I can see that the time is flying. So we have discussed the 3 shifts. I am incredibly curious now to know which one of those shifts resonates with you the most. Look at those. I'm going to ask the poll to be started. To be launched. Yes, look at those. The identity shift from answers to questions, from the mindset shift from power to empowerment, the paradigm shift from IQ to EQ. I'm looking now at the results. So it looks like the second shift from power to empowerment resonates most with you. And I can understand that. think about the power in organizations that we're going to unleash in terms of creative, innovative power, the energy that we're going to unleash once we shift from power to empowerment. Thank you very, very much. Now, Francis, if people have entered already some comments about their rationale, it may be interesting just to look at some of those.
One is, I think, a paradigm shift is a prerequisite for 1 and 2. EQ is becoming more relevant in managing teams remotely. We have, I love seeing successful people. It's going so fast. All are important. Mindset shift most difficult because we believe that, which is a very interesting one. Leadership.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah.
In the past, leadership was associated with power, which is
exactly
the future of leadership. And this brings me just really quickly to one last question from me, and that's in leadership development. So we see, these shifts going. Is there a shift in the leadership development already to prepare leaders for the future of leadership?
We have started applying those shifts already at IMD in the design of programs. As we mentioned, I direct two leadership programs. One of them is mobilizing people. It's a long 9-day program where we try to go quite deep. And I'm working on a session on asking questions, which will become part of the design next year. But the other 2 shifts, the moving from power to empowerment and working on emotional intelligence, is already actually part of the design of the program. And similar story on the side of Strategies for Leadership, the program for women executives.
Wonderful. Before I get your closing remarks, I just want to thank everybody that's joined this webinar. I see there's tons of questions out there. Unfortunately, you're going to have to come to either MP or Strategies for Leadership to ask Ginka some more questions. They're very small groups, and you can ask questions throughout that. Ginka, any closing remarks from you that you want to leave people with?
There's this competition which is called 6-word memo. So allegedly, Hemingway was once asked, what is the shortest novel that you could write? And he said, for sale, baby shoes never worn. I couldn't verify this quote, but allegedly it's Hemingway who came up with it. So nowadays there are competitions around 6-word memos, trying to capture very complex things in a simple way with 6 words. So if you have any ideas how we can capture those 3 shifts, each and every one of them with 6 words, please do send me an email. I would really, really appreciate your ideas here, because I'm going to learn from you. I'm going to learn how you perceive those shifts, what you think about them. And good luck working on those shifts or other shifts which are going to take place.
Thank you, Ginka. And once again, thank you everybody from joining. We're just slightly off Swiss. We're about 1 minute late. Thank you all, and good luck on your leadership journeys. Pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining. All the best. Bye-bye.